Hey guys, I'm Chris Bach and a very warm welcome to Friday Fretworks. And on this week's video, in case you hadn't guessed from the introduction, we're taking a closer look at arguably one of the most famous or infamous pedals ever to have been created, and that is of course the Klon Centaur Professional Overdrive. Now, before we get too heavily into the whys and the wherefore in regard to why this particular pedal has such an enduring legacy, I think it's important to give a level of background history and context to the situation, which ultimately will hopefully give you a better understanding as to why currently a good example of a Klon Centaur on Reverb or on eBay will set you back somewhere in the region of about £1,500 to £2,000. Either way, I think we can all agree that that is a pretty insane price for a pedal, which initially, at its time of release, probably would have cost you about a tenth of that. So I'm going to try and break the video down into a couple of key points, which, as I said, will hopefully give you some level of understanding as to why things have unfolded in the way that they have. Number one, the sound. What is it? What does it do? And most importantly, for any bit of musical gear, how does it sound? Now, it's funny that the Klon Centaur Professional Overdrive, as the name suggests, was indeed marketed as an overdrive pedal. Initially retailed at $225, which in today's money, at present in 2019, works out at about $390. So a fairly big investment, and I guess straight away that set it apart in a league of its own from a lot of the competition, whether it was Boss or whether it was the Tube Screamer, which was actually around at the time. Now, funnily enough, the Tube Screamer is probably the reason why this pedal actually came into existence. Now, there's a lot of online chatter in regard to whether the Klon is actually a modified version of a Tube Screamer. This whole kind of discussion sort of ceased about 10 years ago when the circuit was actually degooped, something I'll get onto in a minute. But as I said, the reason it was invented was basically to be the antithesis of a Tube Screamer. Bill Finnegan, the co-designer of the Klon, was a big fan of his twin reverb when it was kind of cranked to the point where it was starting to naturally break up and naturally compress. However, all of the gigs that he was doing weren't really conducive to turning his amp up to that level. So he set about designing something which would kind of get him into that ballpark, but at more reasonable levels. And thus the Klon Centaur was born. Ultimately something that would make his amp sound a little bit more cranked, but without fundamentally changing its tone. Now, obviously the Tube Screamer, very distinctive bass cut and an incredibly distinctive mid hump, which I guess is fantastic for standing out in a mix. But if you like the inherent tone of your amplifier and don't necessarily want to change that, Tube Screamer probably isn't the pedal for you. And as such, as I said, Bill set about designing something that was very unique and very, at the time, kind of misunderstood, I guess, given the time that this was, kind of early 90s, I guess, was prime era for rack mount units and multi-effects boxes. So something which cost the best part of $400, which only had 3 knobs and only did one job, was probably seen as slightly ridiculous at the time. Number 2, the Rarity. Now, much like a 59 Les Paul or any number of things that we can pinpoint throughout history and kind of allude to their now inflated price, a big part of the Klon's appeal and current price has to do with the fact that not many of them were actually made. The initial run ran between 1994 and 2000, and in that time it's believed that about 8,000 units were made. Bill was actually hand-wiring these himself, building them on a succession of fold-out tables in a succession of apartments that he lived in Boston at the time. It really wasn't a big operation, and as such, not many of them were actually made. Now, because it was a relatively homespun operation, obviously the rate at which Bill was turning these out was relatively slow, and as such, the retail value in the second-hand market for a Klon already had started to climb, still at the point Bill was actually making them. That is unfortunately how it works, and if you want one, but you're not necessarily willing to wait 2, 3, maybe 4 months that Bill was actually taking to turn these units around, you would turn to the second-hand market, whether, I guess, back in the mid-90s, you would have been looking at kind of music magazines or stuff like that. Straight away, the second-hand value had started to climb. Number 3, and I guess arguably most important in regard to why the Klon Centaur now fetches the price that it actually does, is the celebrity users. Not so much endorsers, in that I would doubt that any of these were actually official affiliations. Guys picking them up on the second-hand market, I imagine, and then discovering the joys of the Klon. And obviously, the more high-profile the player, the more it's going to drive the second-hand value through the roof. Now, I'm going to flick through a couple of famous settings here that I found online, just to show you how these guys are actually using them. And it's interesting to note that, without exception, really, all of them are using them as they were initially intended, as an overdrive pedal. Now, as I said, within the past 10 years or so, they've gathered this reputation as a fantastic clean boost, which, as I said, is how I actually use mine on my Centaur, which I shall get into in a minute. But, as I said, it's worth noting that all of these guys are using them pretty drastically as overdrive pedals, which, again, if you pay too much attention to the forum chatter, they haven't got a great reputation as overdrive pedals, which, again, just goes to point out the sort of ridiculousness of don't believe everything that you read online. So if you put all of the above points together, hopefully we'll give you some level of understanding as to why in 2019 an original Klon will set you back, as I said, about 10 times the initial retail price, not taking inflation into account. However, it is definitely worth mentioning that as much as that price is out of the reach of mere mortals like me and you, fortunately, there are some very good clones, clone here being spelled with a K, obviously, out there available and very much within reach of, a more kind of modest budget. Now, before we get into those, it is definitely worth mentioning that the circuit for the Klon was only really made widely available in 2009, some kind of 14, 15 years after it was initially introduced. Now, this is because Bill Finnegan very cleverly covered the initial circuit in goop, which what that means basically is an epoxy resin which covers the finer points and the details of the circuit, ergo making it much harder to actually clone. Now in 2009 someone actually did manage to remove the goop from the circuit, and then despite a little bit of uncertainty over some diodes, leading to a rather clever quip even in the newer KTR unit, people did actually get to the bottom of what the circuit is comprised of, and ever since that point there have been some fantastic clones out there. Now, number 1, definitely worth mentioning, is going to be the Klon KTR. Now, this is the official successor to the original Klon Centaur. Bill introduced this in 2012, and again, unfortunately, as the initial plan was to actually make this an unlimited run, it did have a very kind of limited period, and again, consequently, the second-hand prices have started to climb. You can still find a couple of original units from various shops dotted about, but they are fairly scarce. However, it is a fantastic sounding unit. It does look very different from the original, which was actually an intended point of Bill's, to make this a little bit more pedalboard friendly, but still look as distinctive as the original. And obviously, as a lot of people have pointed out, it has Bill's unique sense of humour plastered across the front of the pedal, possibly a little quip at the kind of internet sort of chatter and nonsense, I guess, which has arisen in the past couple of years, kindly reminding you that that's not really of his creating. Whether you believe that or not, who knows, but it's a fantastic sounding pedal that does sound very close, if not near enough identical to the original. Number 2, and actually my clone of choice, is the Cherrytone, I do believe it's pronounced Centaur. Now this is made in Malaysia by Cherrytone, who have a fantastic reputation for cloning amplifiers and pedals obviously, and again is very affordable with a very limited wait list. Obviously aesthetically as well, if you're into that thing, it kind of looks identical to the original, which again is a large part of the appeal of these units, is that they do look fairly distinctive. Now I'm going to do an ABC test back and forth between the original unit, the Centaur, and the KTR, and hopefully you'll agree that they do sound incredibly, near as damn it, bang on. So there you have it. As I said, hopefully this video will have given you just some understanding in regard to not only what an original Klon Centaur sound like, but also a better appreciation of why 24, 25 years after its release, there is more talk about this pedal than ever, and they are fetching new insane prices. I guess ultimately it's what us guitarists love, more tone hunting and more just generally chance to talk about pedals really. So there we have it. As ever, I've been Chris Buck. This has been Friday Fretworks. A massive thank you for watching. Please just subscribe if you haven't already, and I shall see you next week for another episode. Cheers guys, take care, and I shall see you soon.